Today we are going to be finalizing our little mini-series going through the top 10 weapons in each stats category for Elden Ring, where of course today I'm showing you the top 10 Arcane weapons. Again, just to finally reiterate, every piece of gameplay you're going to be seeing is from New Game Plus 7, and I'm not including power stancing weapons because otherwise again this list would just be dominated by twin blades and curved swords with, say, seppuku on them, making use of their unique jumping attacks. We're just going to be talking about weapons that naturally scale with Arcane, so this is going to be a very juicy list. But just before we jump into the list, I've got a really important announcement for you guys. As some of you will be aware, earlier on this year, we partnered with Project Orochi to launch our collaboration in making some really cool shirts. Well, that collection is now expanding with 2 more really cool designs, taking inspiration from characters from some of our favorite games. And of course, much like our first piece that we made around Yura, these designs are made in a way that is not so obvious that it's YouTuber merch and actually looks really professional and really cool. So it's kind of like a if you know, you know kind of situation if you meet somebody on the street wearing one of our shirts. But that's not the only thing, because we're also releasing some hoodies, because I know some of you were asking for that. And as of this video going live, Project Orochi is currently running their Black Friday sale, as that is running from 12 PM EST until midnight that same day. So you basically have 12 hours as of this video going live to make use of that Black Friday sale. But don't worry, because of course if you're watching this later on in the weekend, I still have a chance for you to get some money off. Project Orochi have very kindly given me my own discount code, so if you use the code JAZZA after the Black Friday sales, you can still get yourself 10% off everything in the Project Orochi shop. So again, if you want to get some previous shirts of ours or just have a scan around the entire website, feel free to do that. And hey, if you're running out of Christmas present ideas, maybe I've just found you a solution. But all jokes aside, like I said, thank you to Project Orochi. Feel free to check them out in the description. But yeah, we should really get into this top 10 Arcane list, so let's do that right now. Of course, with a top 10 Arcane list, you can probably imagine it's going to be dominated by bleed weapons, which unfortunately, yes it is, but I'm still going to be throwing a few curveballs in here. And I guess maybe one of the first ones that you might not expect to be on this list is the weapon that we have in the number 10 spot, and that is going to be Morgott's Curse Sword. Again, we're just including weapons that naturally have an arcane scaling, and Morgott's Curse Sword is actually a very powerful curved greatsword with again a very unique Ash of War that allows you to lunge forward at your enemies, causing not only a deadly blood flame blade attack in front of you, but also leaves explosions with each swipe, dealing multiple hits in quick succession. The reason why it's here at the number 10 spot is just because it's not quite as powerful in New Game Plus 7 compared to the other weapons that we're of course going to talk about in a minute, and where this is naturally a little bit slower too, you're not going to be proccing the bleed as much, although you do get a very healthy addition to your blood loss build up. When you do pump basically everything into Arcane, you can actually get this above 100 very easily, so it is still viable. If you do just want to lean into the heavy attacks, again you'll still be doing a healthy amount of stance damage, but again, as you're going to see in a moment, this weapon just doesn't quite hit as hard. It basically relies on the bleed and the Ash of War to deal the most amount of damage, so when you do come up against someone who can't bleed, like Radagon for instance, it's very noticeable that this weapon does become a bit lackluster, but it is a super fun weapon, and when you can pull off the full Ash of War and get the moveset down, it is really cool to use and is still deserved to be in the top 10 list. Just unfortunately, it can't go much higher. But swiftly moving on to the weapon that we have at number 9, this is actually one you might expect to see a little bit higher in my particular list, but I'm actually putting the Obsidian Lamina here. And again, hear me out, because I'm coming at it from a New Game Plus 7 perspective. This weapon basically suffers the same fate as the Morgott's Curse Sword in terms of its speed. It is undoubtedly one of the coolest scythes in the game, but again, with it being a scythe, it predominantly does slash damage, which is not the greatest attacking type in the game, and although the dynastic sickle play is just super fun and super cool to pull off, the secondary follow-up animation takes a good while. You also do not have any hyper armor during this final move, so unless you can get the timing down perfectly, as this whole thing lasts about 5 seconds, you will be trading hits. But let me tell you, when you do pull off the full sickle play and then dive out the way, my god, do you feel like a total badass. But like I say, unfortunately, due to its speed, you are going to be caught out quite a bit, especially against late game bosses, and especially in the DLC. So with this, you're either going to have to rely on the heavy attacks to do the additional stance damage, or as I say, just try and find like the perfect window to get the full Asher War off, because it actually does quite a high amount of stance damage if you can. And then of course, it also has innate bleed build-up, which again will be boosted with your Arcane stat with its natural scaling in Arcane. So even if you just wanted to rely on the light attacks with this weapon, you can proc bleed relatively quickly. But I don't know, is it my skill issue getting in the way of this weapon being any higher? Obviously let me know in the comments, because at number 8 I have put the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword here, because not only is it a mouthful to say, but again in a list that is predominantly bleed based weapons, which are also really fast moving and can proc it easily, the Meteoric Greatsword unfortunately does not come with any bleed, but it is a fantastic colossal sword. The Ash of War, the white light charge, allows you to fling yourself forward at your enemies doing pierce damage at the same time, but then if you follow up your Ash of War by pressing the Ash of War button again, you will then do an explosion of that ancient meteoric light, which again is very heavy hitting. I believe a full use of this Ash of War does around about 40 odd stance. So by connecting with both stages of this, you're doing quite a healthy amount of damage, and of course stance damage too, and that white charge also knocks back certain enemies. So humanoid enemies like Melania or anybody like the Misbegottens will indeed be knocked over whenever you hit them with this, but even Crucible Knights and people that are a little bit heavier armored will also be staggered when they get hit by this explosion, allowing you to either follow up with another attack or dodge or do whatever it is to have the edge in your fight. So again, if you use this Ash of War correctly, it's actually super good, because it actually covers a long distance too. So where colossal swords again would normally suffer with their speed, the Ancient Meteoric Greatsword gives you an option with speed to close the gap, deal a load of damage, knock your enemies over, and then just continue to wail on them until you either defeat them or break their stance. Again, this weapon's just super unfortunate because it's going to be in the list comprised of the most ridiculous bleed weapons that we'll come to in a moment, which is why it isn't any higher. But it's not to say that the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword is bad by any stretch of the imagination, because it's really good, and I heavily advise that you grab it and try it for yourself, because if you've ever played Soul Calibur before, it's going to unlock a lot of memories. But talking of memories, probably going to unlock a load for those of you that have played the game since day one, and that is because in the number 7 spot we have got the Bloody Hellis, the OG Obsidian Lamina with a very similar Ash of War, this time being Dynast Finesse, which instead of giving you a 2-hour long animation to do the attack, you can just simply press your Ash of War button to do a very similar move out of the way and dodge any attack that comes your way, before then hitting your heavy attack to send an impaling thrust at your enemies. This, of course, is much faster, much more simple, and much easier to pull off against everybody, because it's again a much quicker animation. But the Bloody Hellis also comes with a better arcane scaling, so therefore has a better amount of bleed buildup when you upgrade your arcane stat, and it's also a thrusting sword, so naturally does pierce damage too. Compare it side by side with the Obsidian Lamina, this thing just beats it, all ends up. And as I say, where you can get better bleed buildup, even if you do just have to rely on the light attacks with this weapon, you're going to be causing a bleed very quickly. But also Dynast Finesse does a good amount of stance damage, and you can of course use the heavy attacks as well with this weapon and still stance break some of the hardest bosses relatively easily, even in New Game Plus 7. So this is basically the older but better brother of the Obsidian Lamina, because it doesn't lollygag and mess around, it just gets the job done there and then, simple as you like. And I am probably being a bit harsh by putting it here in the number 7 spot, but this weapon is insane. So if you haven't used it yet, go and pick it up, because I can guarantee you, you're going to have an immense amount of fun. And again, just to swiftly move things on, in the number 6 spot, I have put the Blood Fiend's Fork here. And for those of you that are fans of the channel, you've probably seen this weapon being used in a more recent video, but again, we were power stancing it then. But even without power stancing the fork, you can get a ridiculous output with your bleed buildup, especially if you turn it into a blood affinity. So by whacking on seppuku and having around about 60 arcane in your build, you can have over 170 bleed buildup, which is nuts. And I'll be completely honest, it is simply only here because of that fact. The actual weapon itself does not deal a huge amount of damage. You should be seeing me fight Phantom Godfrey in this segment somewhere, where that fight lasted a good sort of like 2 or 3 minutes, but if you do come up against anybody that can bleed, the time of your fight will drastically change, going from about 2 or 3 minutes to about 2 or 3 seconds. Just simply because of that, that is why this weapon is so high. But like I mentioned with the Hellis, I'm probably being a bit harsh on the Hellis because you could probably swap these two around, but for me, just where this weapon can still make the majority of boss fights an absolute joke with its bleed build-up, it had to be here. Again, it does still do pierce damage where it's a spear, so although it wasn't doing the most damage against enemies that don't bleed, it's still doing somewhat damage and it's manageable, but it's definitely not the heaviest of hitting weapons. Bleed basically trumps all, which is again why it finds itself in the number 6 spot. And speaking of that, that's a good way to introduce our weapon in the number 5 spot, because at number 5 I have put the Rivers of Blood here. Yes, you did hear me correctly, everyone's favorite katana is sitting in the number 5 spot, and that's mainly because for me, it heavily relies on its Ash of War once again to deal its insane amount of damage. But of course, don't get me wrong, if you can pull off the full Ash of War, then you are going to do an immense amount of damage. But if for whatever reason you're up against an enemy that's a lot faster, let's just say you're in the DLC and therefore don't have too many windows to get the full thing off, you are gonna struggle, as at base value, the Rivers of Blood is not the best weapon in the game. In actual fact, it's not even the best katana in the game in my opinion, and the actual moveset with the weapon is extremely lackluster, especially in New Game Plus 7, and of course, if enemies don't bleed, then you're going to have an even more rough time using this weapon, as you're not even going to be able to rely on its insane bleed build-up, and of course, the Corpse Pilot Ash of War. Don't get me wrong, this weapon also has innate fire damage because it is a blood flame weapon, but even that doesn't help it tremendously. So for a weapon that is so heavily reliant on its Ash of War to do well, it can't really be considered much higher in my opinion, because as I've said many times already, if you come up against somebody that is resistant to that Ash of War, then you're screwed. Like, you haven't really got a backup option. But if you did have to rely on just the katana's base moveset and you are against somebody who can bleed, you will still be doing a comfortable blood loss of around about 75 with just 60 Arcane, so you can rely on the bleed procs, but again, in New Game Plus 7, that may take a little while to kick in, so for me, that is why the Rivers of Blood is here at number 5. And another reason as to why it's here at number 5 is because the weapon that we have at number 4 is going to go to Mogwin's Sacred Spear. Basically, this weapon is a carbon copy in terms of how you use it, so it's an Ash of War merchant, but it has a much better scaling than the Rivers of Blood. Where Mogwin's Sacred Spear is also a great spear, you can get the AR up of this weapon much higher than the Rivers of Blood with similar stats, and the Ash of War can be used at a much larger distance. Of course, in the base game, that is how you can just rinse through the entire game. Again, in the DLC, you're not going to be able to pull it off as much, but even if you can just use it the once, or use it as sort of like a buff, if you will, when you use the Blood Boon ritual, you will infuse the Great Spear with the Blood Boon effect, which is essentially Blood Flame Blade, adding additional bleed to the base weapon and additional fire damage. So add that on to the pierce damage and the fact that it's a Great Spear, so it can do a good amount of stance damage with charged heavies too. You have got a lot more coverage with the base weapon than you do compared to things like the Rivers of Blood. So even against enemies that don't bleed, you can still do a significant amount of damage, a significant amount of stance damage, and get through those boss fights much easier compared to those other weapons we mentioned before. But of course, the reason why this weapon is so high on the list is because of the Blood Boon ritual Ash of War, because again, it does stunlock NPCs or humanoid bosses like Melania, so for the majority of the game, you can just sit there holding or pressing your LT or L1 button whilst you watch your favourite movie on another screen, and hey presto, the boss is dead. But of course, it doesn't work against every single boss, so that's why it doesn't get any higher in this list. But a weapon that certainly is deserved of going higher in this list, and is actually kicking off our top 3, is going to be the Rejuvia. Although this is a dagger, and therefore you're probably thinking, well, this is going to do hardly any damage, Jazza. Why is a dagger making it into the top 3? Oh, Oh, that's why. Yeah, basically the Rejuvia's Bloodblade Ash of War is nuts and can actually hit enemies twice, because if you're close enough to the enemy, you can hit them with the physical blade and then the projectile that would normally come out of it at the same time, and this weapon, again with 60 Arcane, can have over 90 blood loss. For the fact that the Ash of War does additional blood loss, you can more or less proc bleed in just 1 or 2 hits of the Ash of War and continue to do so multiple times, because the FP cost of this Ash of War is next to nothing, but even at base value, this weapon does pure physical damage. Again, it does do a mixture of slash and pierce damage, with the pierce damage only really coming from the two-handed heavy attacks, but where it is physical damage, you can just rely on the DPS moveset of a regular dagger, and that can be transferable against bosses that don't bleed. So you more or less have the same damage as things like the Rivers of Blood against enemies that don't bleed, but can actually do heightened damage with the Ash of War, whilst destroying everything else that does bleed, because I mean the damage numbers are just outright ridiculous with this thing. And if for whatever reason you want to close the gap or your enemies walk away from you, the Ash of War also, like I say, is a projectile, so you can fling it at your enemies from somewhat of a distance. It doesn't cover the hugest amount of ground, but if you're right on top of them, hit them a couple of times and you decide to like dodge out the way, you can just keep pressing the Ash of War button and fling the Bloodblade at them instead. So it's quick, it's nimble, it's super powerful, and does a ridiculous amount of blood loss, which is why it's trumped the rest of the weapons we've talked about so far. But of course, again, it is a little bit lackluster against those enemies that don't bleed, so therefore cannot be any higher in this list. But yeah, you're gonna have to let me know on this one, guys. Do you think the Rejuvia's is worthy of being in the top 3? I certainly think so, but let me know if you guys think the same. But as you're typing out your comments, probably telling me I'm an idiot down below, I should also let you know what I've got in the number 2 spot. So runner-up in this list does go to my beloved Eleonora's Poleblade. You knew it was going to feature in here somewhere, and unfortunately it's not the number 1 weapon, because although I've got a huge bias to this weapon, as you guys know, even I am not stupid enough to put it in the number 1 spot, because there is just one other weapon that's just ridiculous. But it doesn't mean I can't put it in the number 2 spot, because all jokes aside, as much as I'm an absolute fanboy for this weapon, it genuinely is really, really good. Where it is a twin blade and has the same natural attributes of things like the Rivers of Blood with its fire damage and also blood flame effects, you basically have a much faster version of the Rivers of Blood. And the Ash of War not only is super cool, as it basically turns you into a humanoid Beyblade, but it also gives you hyper armor and does a nice amount of stance damage too, if you can pull the full thing off. And much like the sickle play and finesse Ash of Wars from other weapons earlier, it is a lunging move which will allow you to retract in the final stages, potentially dodging moves with the entire Ash of War. So if you are much more skilled than me, you can apply the same timing from the Dynastic Sickle Play or the Dynastic Finesse to deal a load of damage, deal a load of stance damage, and get back out of there. But again, this weapon also has a slightly better arcane scaling and can get slightly more blood loss out of it compared to the Rivers of Blood. And where you have a twin blade and are therefore hitting your enemies many more times in the same time frame, that blood loss can be devastating, especially if you use the light attacks and the unique heavy attack, which does many hits in quick succession. And again, where this is a twin blade, the final strike of most of those movesets will be doing a high amount of damage. So even against Radagon and the Elden Beast, a charged heavy can do sort of like 2,000-3,000 damage, but even just simple light attacks can also do upwards of 1,000 damage, which makes this even more viable compared to the other weapons against enemies that do not bleed. Again, that's just simply down to how fast twin blades are and how fast their movesets are. So again, this weapon is a perfect combination of being quick, nimble, powerful, and super stylish, so what's there not to love about this weapon? But now that I've glazed the Eleonora's Poleblade for about 2 minutes straight, as I mentioned earlier, it did have to accept defeat to one other weapon, which of course is the one that we've got at the number 1 spot. I'm sure you guys can probably hazard a guess what it is, and yep, it is indeed the Blood Fiend's arm. I'm sure, like I say, most of you saw this coming from a mile off, because not only is this the best weapon in the game, in my opinion, it of course is the best Arcane Weapon 2. The Bloodfiend's arm has a much higher natural arcane scaling and therefore can pump the bleed build up into the 200 marks if you make this a blood affinity, and where this is a common weapon and therefore you can change the Ash of War, you can apply things like Cragblade to increase the natural stance damage of the charged heavies from around about 52 and make them closer to the 60 mark. So yes, doing around about 60 stance damage if not more with every charged heavy attack. This means even in New Game Plus 7, 2 or 3 charged heavies with Cragblade active will indeed break most bosses. Throw in the fact that it's a colossal weapon that does a tremendous amount of damage anyway and has almost 200 bleed just simply with 60 arcane in your build. Yeah, this thing is just, it's a monster. Also, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this weapon also has one of the best sort of recovery times from its charged heavies compared to other colossal weapons, but I might be wrong with that, but it definitely feels a lot quicker, that's for sure. So pulling off the charged heavies isn't actually that detrimental and is actually relatively quick considering the damage output, so you can also throw that on top of it too. And if you want to find out the best build for this weapon, as with all the other top 10 weapon lists, all of the builds are going to be in the description down below. Those links will take you to the most recent videos where those particular builds feature, whether that be another sort of like top 5 that we did. I will put in brackets like what actual number it is so you can go straight to it, but all of the videos showing you how to get the weapon and then of course more importantly making the best build around it will be down in the description, so also check that out. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you also want to check out Project Orochi, feel free to do that. They've got their Black Friday sale on right now, so definitely make use of that if you can. But like I also mentioned in the promo, don't worry too much because even after the Black Friday sales, we have now got our own unique code, and again, thank you for Project Orochi for doing this, where you can use the code JAZZA to get yourself 10% off. So yeah, if you are seeing this after today, don't worry, we still got you covered with some form of healthy discount, which again, you can make use of all year round and get yourself some really cool pieces of clothing. But now that I've said all of that, that is the top 10 Arcane list. Obviously, let me know if you guys agree with this list at all, and if you don't, feel free to explain why and give me your top 10 Arcane list. But obviously, this is the end of the mini-series, and if you have enjoyed it, please do leave a like rating down below, as it not only helps out the channel tremendously, but also lets me know if you want to see any more top 10s around other parts of the game, like maybe sorceries, incantations, or even the different damage types in the game, like the pierce damage and slash damage that we were talking about today. So if you want to see more of those, hit that like button too, and if you're new around here and want to stay up to date with the rest of the Elden Ring content, make sure you hit that subscribe button as well. We're on the way to 35,000 subscribers, so let's see if we can get that done relatively soon. But that is genuinely it from me now, guys, so thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you have a great day, but I guess for now, I will catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.